Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation. Today is Monday, December 16th, 2024, and I'm happy to be here with Meisa Irshaid, Rela Mazali, and Jonathan Metzl. Our topic today is guns, small arms, light weapons, the kind that are prolific in the United States where Jonathan and I are located, and where nearly a third of adults own guns and about 40% of adults live in a home with a gun, according to Pew Research Center's July 2024 report. These guns are the kind that are becoming increasingly common in Israel-Palestine, not just in or through the Israeli military, which obviously dominates the space, but also throughout civilian spaces, in homes, in businesses, in communities. Before we get into our discussion, a little background on our guests. Meisa Irshaid is an attorney and an activist and a legal advisor to the NGO Gun-Free Kitchen Tables. We're going to hear a lot about gun-free kitchen tables and this work during our conversation, so I won't say any more about it now. Meisa is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, a board member at the Human Rights Defenders Fund, and former attorney in the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. In the last year, she was co-founder also of Women Against Weapons, which focuses on fact-finding among Palestinians in Israel, combining a perspective of gender and ethnicity. Rela Mazali is a writer, an independent scholar, and a feminist anti-militarist who co-founded Gun-Free Kitchen Tables, where she now serves as the coalition coordinator. Rela was born Jewish in Israel, where she has lived most of her life, which, as she sees it, places her in a position of privilege. Privilege she has resisted since 1980 by actively opposing Israel's militarization and military occupation, co-founding the New Profile movement to demilitarize society and state in 1998, and the Small Arms Disarmament and Gun Control Project, Gun-Free Kitchen Tables, the Gun-Free Kitchen Tables Coalition, founded in 2010. And Dr. Jonathan Metzl is a psychiatrist and sociologist. He is Frederick B. Rentschler II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry, and the Director of the Department of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Jonathan works on a wide range of issues, including mental illness and gun violence, and race and whiteness in America. He's the author of many books, most recently, What We've Become, Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. Rela, Meisa, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today. I've just given some introductions to this audience. Is there anything else any of you wants to add before we dive in? Is there anything more you want to tell our audience about your approach or your connection to the issue of guns and guns in Palestine, guns in Israel, as we're diving in?
I'm good to go.
You're good to go.
Me too.
Let's,
We'll be
fantastic.
engaged in the conversation.
Let's dive right in. So we're going to start. I want to ask you to set us up with the realities before October 7th, 2023. And Jonathan, I want to ask to start with you. Your research focuses primarily on the US, but you have been working with colleagues in Israel on the issue of guns in society for many years. Will you talk to us, please, about the frameworks you use to approach guns? You've written, oh, I'll stop. Go, jump in.
No, yeah, I've been studying guns in the United States for probably over 15 years now. I grew up in Missouri. I live in Tennessee. I am absolutely not anti-gun. I don't want to grab anybody's gun or stop anybody's gun. I grew up, I was born on an Air Force base. My dad was in the Air Force when I was born. And so I've been around people with guns for much of my life. Um, and and at the same time, what I saw in my research and also in the places I was living was an expansion of gun policies. There was an identity of what it meant to be a good or responsible gun owner, which once meant um, that you did hunting or that you had your family gun that was passed down or that you were in the military, all these things that are great, or even that you owned guns for sporting or all these kind of things. And I just saw over time that there was a push a political push, an economic push to say no. A good gun owner, as people I interview, has 30 AR-15s in their house and is against any kind of regulation whatsoever. And even after a mass shooting, that means you go out and you get more guns. And so I started to ask the question, how did we polarize around this issue? And for me, part of it was about stories about race in America, that gun ownership tapped into deep racial divides, which is part of the research I've done. And then I also look at findings. My most recent book, for example, looks at a finding that after a mass shooting, half the country says this means we need tighter regulations, and half the country says we need more guns. There was a finding by a research center that showed that conservative Americans largely supported the statement that mass shootings are the price we pay to live in a free society. And so part of what I've done is ask, first of all, how did we get so divided on this issue to the point where even on one hand, any regulation becomes a non-starter, and on the other hand, on the left, there are a lot of stereotypes about what it means to own a gun or carry a gun that tap into other kinds of ideologies. And so I try to tell that American story. But the other issue for me is that I've been working with Physicians for Human Rights Israel Palestine for the past over a decade now. And I remember when I started going to Israel, looking at guns and doing research and interventions across Israel and the region and the territories. I um, I repeatedly would hear people say, "Man, you know, I'm glad I'm not in the U.S.," which was kind of interesting. I mean, I once I gave a talk for Physicians for Human Rights, and the NRA was trying to make inroads into Israel, and it was almost like, "Oh my God, that'll never happen here because we have a public health infrastructure." But other times, like I'll never forget this. I was doing an interview at the uh, Jalazon refugee camp in the West Bank, and there were like literally like bomb. You could hear police, everything, and chaos and things like that. And I was interviewing this woman, and she said, "Oh, you're from the U.S.? That must be really dangerous with all those guns or something." So this idea of like guns being an American ethos was something that differentiated. That was something unique to the United States, and increasingly two things I found, and I'll end here, are that I saw gun politics becoming increasingly anti-democratic. That's part of what I argue in my research, that if you arm one side and not the other side, you overturn the hope or the possibility that people are going to get along or find common solutions. Instead, disagreement becomes lethal, and so you're arming internally and externally. So part of it is about the anti-democratic politics of guns, but also, as I've been writing about recently in Zocalo and the LA Times and other places, I'm seeing that logic, that really American logic spread to Israel in ways that I think are incredibly, incredibly dangerous, not just for health reasons, but for democratic ones.
Thank you for all of that. And we're going to have links to your writing in the podcast show notes so everybody can read and will be able to read your articles. Thank you for all of that. Rela, I want to jump in with you. So you've been focused on guns for the proliferation of guns and small arms in civilian society for the last 10 to 15 years. And you were the lead author and researcher on the first rigorous report on small arms in Israel, which we're also going to have a link to. It's called Loose Guns, Israeli-Controlled Small Arms in the Civil Sphere. We published in 2017. So will you talk to us, please? And still, this is before October 7th, because just to let the audience know what's coming, things have changed enormously in the last 15 months. But Rela, talk to us about guns in civil society in Israel, Palestine. Who has them? How common are they? What do you have to do to get one, please? And also, Israel is a militarized society. So you talk about civil space. What does civil space even mean?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for hosting us, first of all, on this podcast, Sarah. And this question in particular, thank you for it. It really cuts through to the core, the deep running militarization of society and state here. Army bases and security installations control about 80% of the land inside what's called the Green Line. So first, civil space is a physical concept, a geographical concept. It's non-military space outside of security installations, but it's also a political space that enables and supports the exercise of democratic civic practices, which are not typically part of a military or security structure. And it's also demographic. It's space mostly peopled by civilians. So homes and families, for example, are largely, not always, but largely a type of civil space. And inside these, we know from the US that guns pose increased risks to women. The studies show that the risk of a woman's murder is 3 to 5 times higher in homes with guns. And this year here in this country, guns killed so far, we're not at the end of the year yet, over a third of the women murder victims. As to the issue of how do you get a gun, when you ask that question in the US, you're asking about privately owned firearms. But here there are multiple legal channels for getting a gun. I'll start with private civilian guns. So to get one of those, you apply to a government agency that reviews your application and does or doesn't issue a license. Starting from the late 80s, the proliferation of private guns was actually reduced systematically. But that policy was overturned in 2018. And during this past year plus, as you pointed out, Sarah Ann, a whole series of legislative moves has loosened criteria for who gets a gun again and again. Some of the new regulations are even tailored to serve specific interest groups, including entire cohorts of Jewish West Bank settlers who were previously under license age. And this is happening while settlers' gun violence against Palestinians in the West Bank is spiking enormously. In recent months, the UN reported that during our olive harvest, which begins in October, I'm quoting from a document of theirs, Palestinian farmers have faced a sharp increase in settler-related violence, at least a threefold increase compared to each of the preceding 3 years. Notably, Jewish settlers and their guns can move freely in and out of what's known as Israel proper, unlike West Bank Palestinians, of course, who are non-citizens, not citizens of Israel. But to get back to private guns, ownership of these by the end of last year, 2023, was up 40%. That happened within a single year. But you can also get an organizational license through one of over 1,000 strictly civilian organizations authorized to arm their employees. For instance, if you can believe it, the local branch of Coca-Cola. Organizational gun bearers rose recently by 30%. So both those channels saw significant rises. Another completely new way of getting a gun is joining one of 1,000 local security squads that were formed last year in cities and towns and armed thousands of volunteers. This government is handing out hundreds of thousands of new guns through multiple channels. The vast majority of these guns go to Jewish men.
Thank you for all of that, Rela. Thank you for laying out the different categories and also showing us what unifies them. They are primarily, almost entirely Jewish men. Meisa, I want to ask you, so you co-founded an activist initiative, Women Against Weapons, inside the Green Line, side of Israel proper. Will you talk to us about the role of guns in Palestinian communities inside of Israel?
Yeah, thank you, Saran, for having us today. Also, I will continue what Rela started. Rela gave the background of the bigger picture of what's going on for the Israeli society in general, but I need to remind you all that there's 20% of the population in Israel inside the Green Line are Palestinians, Arabs who are affected directly by these guns. And I'll just highlight how it affects our lives in there. So for the recent years, we witnessed a huge rise in the number of Palestinians in Israel who are killed due to structural developments in organized crime and the wave of internal gun violence flooding the Palestinian society. Over the course of the last 10 years, there's a huge number of firearms that even the state cannot give a clear numbers, but of how many guns are held inside the Palestinian society in Israel. When we speak about guns in there, we doesn't mean licensed guns, but unlicensed guns. And over the last decade, there is more than 1,000 victims, including women and children, most of whom their cases are not solved by the police yet, who were killed by shooting. Many of these victims are men between 20 and 35 years old. The bloodiest year was so far 2023, with 244 murders. While this year, by the end of October, we exceeded the 200 victims. And out of the 200, only 27 cases were deciphered. Today, Palestinian cities in Israel and villages are controlled by gun and crime that targets almost every aspect of our lives in there. Guns were pointed toward mayors, school principals, doctors, lawyers, election candidates, women, even in romantic relations, neighbors, family members, like everyone is affected directly by these guns. To have sense of what's going on, if you walk in a neighborhood or a city, Palestinian city in Israel, you would notice that almost every building have several private security cameras that are put in all corners of the building, at least 2 or 3. Some buildings have even more in the same side of the building. You might find 5 or 6. While criminals and hired criminals, they do escape accountability in terms of that the gun shootings and killings incidents usually are not solved. An average Palestinian person in Israel would more likely to die from a gun shooting rather than any other reason. And speaking about social fabric, while being surrounded with so much of guns, whether it's licensed guns in the Israeli community or unlicensed guns in the Palestinian community, it tears up relations. So the common sense of a normal youth or young person in a Palestinian community would be that if he doesn't own a gun by himself to protect himself, he need to be dependent on protection of some crime organization who can give him that protection if needed. So nowadays the discourse among Palestinians is very tensed and very bloody in terms of daily life. Almost every day there's a case, at least one victim of shooting. Some days end up with 3 or 5. Saying that this chaos is taking place in a context. And Rela gave up a little bit of the background, but also there's an intentional lack of state regulation and complicity by the law enforcement agencies responsible for controlling the proliferation of murders. The stockpile of legal and licensed firearms within Jewish Israeli society in the hands of individuals or located in military camps form a primary source of the supply of weapons and ammunition to Palestinian society. Saying that many unlawful firearms end up in the hands of Palestinian citizens in Israel, most of them are in the position of criminal groups by stealing them from military or civilian sources, including thefts from individuals or private security, or even held by private security companies who are apparently should be oversighted by the state, since they are kind of legal companies. Well, just to give you an insight about the numbers of the firearms stolen from the army, so we speak about 200 firearms got into civilian hands from the army, as well as large quantities of ammunition. Many of the soldiers also are involved in trade in the black market for their own personal profits, for sure. Weapons are also obtained through trafficking, particularly from reserves sorted at Israeli military bases located across the country. And in 2020, for example, 102,000 pieces of ammunition were stolen from Israeli military, including bullets, grenades, missiles, and bombs, in addition to another 103 guns, which also were stolen in the same way from military bases.
Thank you for all of that, Meisa. So this is what is setting us up even before the changes of the last year. The licensed weapons among Jewish Israelis, the unlicensed in Palestinian society inside of Israel, and what you've just described about organized crime and this enormous threat to Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, Meisa, I want to stick with you for a moment to talk about what's happened over the last 15 months. We know that Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Gvir has been so focused on arming Jewish Israelis. You published a position paper, which we're going to link to. It's called the Israel is Arming Campaign, a recipe for rising crime and violence among Palestinians. And you talk about the direct relationship between mass civilian armament in Jewish society and the rise in rates of gun crime and armed violence in Palestinian society. And I want to quote just one tiny piece of it and then ask you to unpack it for us, please. You say in this report that the arming of Jewish Israelis is intended to impose, and I'm quoting, heightened Jewish control over Arab Palestinians within the Green Line, in addition to those in the West Bank and Gaza, and further regulate their behavior as part of the practice of Jewish supremacy. Will you unpack that for us, please, Meisa? Talk to us a little bit about what's happened in the last year.
Well, the whole approach of Gvir and even politicians before him, they're all pushing for a dramatic increase in the armament of Israeli Jewish society. Whether it's as a privatization of security responsibility, which means that the state hands the responsibility on civilians, normal citizens, to do the job that the state cannot do or doesn't want to do it. And this is privatization. But also, this approach is consistent with the wider goals of imposing heightened Jewish control over our Palestinians and further regulating their behavior as part of the practice of Jewish supremacy. I'll give you an insight. Inside the Green Line 48, this program strives to entrench Jewish supremacy by mobilizing Jewish society through a high sense of emergency, while arming a significant proportion of Jewish civilians, predominantly men usually, even though there's huge campaigns now also to give guns to women, to suppress their Arab counterparts, which means we have some good examples from workplaces. There's if you work in lawyer's office, and I used to be there once when I was an intern in Jerusalem. I used to work in a Jewish-owned law office, and my colleague in the same room used to have a gun, and usually he were putting the gun in front on his desk, confronting me, like it was the daily practice. So back then, many years ago, that kind of action was not formed under it was not spoken in the office. I was like the only Palestinian working there though, and more than 50 people of 50 employees in the office were Jewish Israelis, and that behavior for me looked very it was very threatening in my experience. I didn't have the right word back then to describe it, but that kind of daily practice, yes, means to give some power or to change the power dynamics in the same room. So the distribution of legal weapons hasn't only negatively impacted Palestinians in Israel, but also Palestinians under occupation in Jerusalem and West Bank. And Rela cited the statistics of the ongoing violence or the increasing violence in the West Bank, and how the guns held by settlers and other Israelis who live in the West Bank control and sheer displacement and disposition over the Palestinian local community in the West Bank. And usually these Israelis who commit offenses using the gun or shooting Palestinians are not held accountable. And there was this case next to Nazareth where car driver decided out of sudden to stop his car and to shoot the other driver who drove next to him, just because maybe he didn't like the way he acted in the street. And that was a young boy of 19 years old who was shooting in front of the cameras and the other passers of the street. So the daily reality in Israel is so tense and racist. So alongside the massive civilian armament, through loosened licensing procedures I mentioned before, it is highly likely to lead to an increase in the number of weapons transferred also unlawfully to criminals or criminal organizations operating in the Arab society, which is another mean of control over a Palestinian society. And as you know, as long as the victim is Palestinian, that even though the authorities, the police is not really doing its job to solve these cases. So the number of victims way higher than the number of the cases solved, and most of the killers are not held accountable in reality.
Thank you, Meisa. Rela, I want to turn to you about what's happened in the last 15 months. And drawing, you co-authored a paper, The Guns of October, the Mass Armament of Civil Spaces in Israel, which we'll also have a link to. And you also, you published an update in just a couple weeks ago in October of 2024, showing this enormous increase in the number of private gun licenses in Israel, a 334% increase in 2024. So I want to ask you, talk to us about what's happening with guns now, since October 7th. Who's getting them? Who's keeping track of them? And how do you explain what's happening now with these guns in Israel? Meisa has already given us where they're going with Palestinian society in terms of being used against Palestinians, and also making more guns that will be stolen and used in unlicensed ways inside of Palestinian communities. But can you lay out for us, Rela, really this impetus towards the mass armament of Jewish Israelis now, please, and the impact?
Yeah, so the country is, as Meisa and you have said, witnessing a process of mass civilian armament in an act of radical privatization. The government is basically handing over responsibility for public security to pretty random, I must say, armed individuals. Of course, I'm referring to armed Jewish individuals, and it's intentionally shedding its responsibility and accountability and cutting costs in the process. Its message is go get a gun, protect yourself. Detailed plans for this move were drawn up by far-right policy forums long before October 2023. They're part of an extreme neoliberal program of privatization and deregulation. It's promoted by far-right groups, which are, by the way, generously funded by mostly US-based Christian Zionist sources and right-wing Jewish Zionist sources. They exploited the Hamas attack of October 7th and the wake of horror and fear that it left. The government used that to kickstart this piece of an already existing program. So literally days after October 7th, it was actually October 15th, it pushed through the first regulations to expand civilian armament significantly and prevented this as its answer to the security failure. Soon enough, in the US, Colt and Smith & Wesson, we're seeing monthly profits rise 3 to 10 times. And the US government went on supplying guns, even though it sanctioned specific West Bank settlers for violence. Ignoring this, it went on supplying guns. It held them up for a very brief time and then continued. And as Meisa already mentioned, armament here is widely accompanied by racist incitement against what's often called the enemy within. You know, that's not an Israeli invention, but we have that here too. And it means very directly Israel's Palestinian citizens. And again, as Meisa has sketched, it's very common knowledge that Jewish shooters can kill with a gun Palestinian citizens and get off scot-free if they claim I sensed my life was in danger. So this new mass of guns is aimed firstly at the country's Palestinian citizenry. And what it does is this threat, in addition to filling this vacuum of no real policing and no real accountability exacted by the police with criminal activity, it also, from the Jewish side, threatens to turn the genocide already underway in Gaza and to a lesser extent, but still in the West Bank, into the country, inwards, at yet another part of the Palestinian people. In a 2021 op-ed I wrote, I described the very close and intricate linkage between Israel's small arms policies and its war policies. They're one piece. Armament on the current scale can very easily ignite and feed into civil war. Looking back at May 2021, when the country was literally on the brink of armed local showdowns that could have easily spread, this possibility is very clearly real and serious. Meanwhile, though, as Meisa has explained, criminal murder rates inside Israel are rising. They doubled from 2021 to 2023, with Palestinian citizens greatly overrepresented among victims. Proliferating guns, though, are also being used already to obstruct democratic process, just as Jonathan's work warns. They're turned on citizens who are protesting, who are expressing solidarity, or taking other forms of democratic action, like opening a cafe on the Sabbath. Personal testimonies from activists and just regular citizens describe armed threats directed at them for civic action. In my view, Israel was never a real democracy. The democratic space that did exist was mainly for Jews, and even that was very unequally democratic. But even this space is now shrinking at gunpoint.
Thank you, Rela. Jonathan, I want to ask you to weigh in as an expert on American-style gun culture and talk to us about how you understand this accelerated gun owning, gun using in Israel-Palestine. We're going to have a link to your piece, your great piece, What Could American-Style Gun Culture Do to Israel? Unpack this for us, please.
Well, thank you. I'm so honored to be part of this conversation, and so many of the things that I'm hearing ring true, both about what I was worried about in writing that piece over the summer, but also what we've seen in the United States. I mean, part of the what we see in the United States is that guns, this is kind of what I argued in my book, what we've become, guns become common sense for people. In a way, they become a form of individualized conflict resolution, and it spreads. And so you can look at the numbers of just gun ownership, for example. Um, we've got many more guns than people in the United States right now. Some people think we're nearing, excuse me, 500 million guns. We've got about 330 million people. So the number of just civilian owned guns, these are not military guns, there's a really almost no endpoint because people get afraid they buy more guns, then people on the other side buy guns. And so we've really created an inter-country arms race in a way, which is furthered by uh, a pandemic. All of a sudden, people say they're going to take your guns, and people rush out to buy guns, or a murder of George Floyd and Black Americans here. You better arm yourself because the police could kill you, or things like that. Every crisis becomes an opportunity to get more guns, which increases the risk of all the things that we've been talking about here. Not just armed conflict, which is a real issue, but also all the risks. I mean, for us, two-thirds of gun death are gun suicide, partner violence, rage shootings, accidental shootings, all the other kinds of shootings. So you're just ratcheting up the risk quite a bit. And so part of the story is just what happens when this becomes a form of sense making. And it becomes our kind of habituated daily reality. We also have more mass shootings than calendar days right now in the United States. And so it just becomes something that people habituate. And so I teach a class, Guns in America, and one of the concepts we learn is who habituates death. And it's usually people in a military conflict. It shouldn't be people who are sending their kids to school or going to the office or things like that. So, in a way, part of the story is guns just become part of the fabric in ways that, if they're not addressed, really have profound um, implications that rip apart the social fabric of a society. And so partially that's in addition to everything we're talking about here, I just, that's for me the worry of all of this. And the other thing I teach about in my class is what's called speculative threat, the idea that basically if you if you somebody cuts you off in traffic, or somebody looks different than you, or they have a different skin color than you, or something else, you immediately jump to this person's a threat and I'm going to whip out my gun. And so everyday interactions, just the lethality of all of that happens independent of all of these bigger issues. And so for me, it's kind of like what happens to even the notion of a democratic society when that level of armament is happening, and it just takes different strategies. But I should also say that initially it was a left-right issue for us. But as things started to go downhill in this regard for us, many more people on the left then started to buy guns. And so Black Americans for a while there after George Floyd were the quickest people, the most steadily rising group of gun owners. Last year, liberals were among the top gun owners because they hadn't had guns, but their neighbors had guns or things like that. And then we've just had a shooting of a healthcare executive that's a hotly debated topic here in the United States. Um, but this is now being celebrated by the left as for some people on social media, an acceptable form of conflict resolution. And so this is kind of what I worried about in the piece I wrote, but also in my book, that when guns become the kind of individualized, tools of conflict resolution, it just becomes harder to do things that you need to do to maintain a democracy, which is on some level have people play by the same rules and not individually decide whose justice is worth metering out. And so I think it's particularly risky in tribalized democratic societies where people have, at least on the face of it, been learned to get along in some way for some kind of democratic norms, but those divisions, tribal divisions and inequities, are very easily manipulated, and then the stakes get higher when you start to add the potential of guns into the mix. And so it's not. I mean, I know that this dynamic is happening around the world right now. It's happening in Hungary and in Australia and in Brazil and other places that were the rise of the political right is part based in support for gun rights. But I think really complex multi-ethnic democracies are the most at risk because it plays to um, the the kinds of agreements people need to make to even live in them in the first place, but also the historical just tensions around those fault lines.
Thank you for all of that. So this is all deeply bleak. I I want to shift us for a moment, not because we can't stay in the threats and in the awfulness, but also because there is more to say here. And I want to ask each of you to talk about what is possible for interrupting or intervening in this moment. And Jonathan, I actually want to start with you. Your long work in the US around guns and your work also in Israel around guns. And you wrote in a Time magazine article, guns are not just a public health problem. You say, quote, that victory will remain elusive if the aim of political power is to enact more of the same gun laws without attending to the larger contexts and structural drivers of violence, unsafety, and democratic decline. So that starts to get at the sense making you were just talking about with us. So how do you relate that analysis to Israel-Palestine? What do you think is necessary for reducing civilian armament in Israel-Palestine? And I know one more question. Could you relate that work to the small arms control, the work for small arms control in other parts of the world too, please?
I just think that there's a certain point at which my work, as people who've read my recent book know, is very critical of the left for misunderstanding the threat that guns represented. Guns definitely represent a public health um, emergency. No doubt about that. I'm a doctor. I agree with that. But gun politics have been used in the US and in Israel to threaten an independent judiciary, to harass politicians, all these things that have nothing to do with really with public health have to do with the safeguards and rails we put around democratic governance in different ways. And so part of what I argue in my work, which was really controversial, I actually have gotten a lot of pushback from the left on the US in the US, is that we need to change our playbook to become much more, on one hand, politically engaged, not about saying, I mean, we had this terrible slogan, I think, in the US that we had common sense gun reform, as if like gun reform was common sense, but it wasn't common sense to half the country who believed that they needed guns to protect their property or their families. And so it was a very liberal notion of common sense. And so partially for all of us, I think it's one on one hand, thinking about what our solutions are, what are solutions we're offering, and what are the ideologies of those solutions. Now, in the US, and I don't know if this is relevant in Israel, I've become a structuralist. And so what I argue toward the end of my book is that there are lots of things we can do to make communities safer. In fact, there's a whole literature that shows that it's largely been done in distressed neighborhoods in the US. But if you fix the street lights and you create green space and you create jobs programs and after school programs, that actually that will reduce rates of gun trauma more than actually trying to create red flag laws or background checks in a way. And so you can actually invest in civic infrastructure. And for me, like in an ideal world, that can become a bipartisan project because then that increases property values and increases investment and makes people kind of feel safe in their neighborhoods. And it's hopefully something that people can get around no matter their ideology. Now, again, this doesn't speak to the Middle East, except that I guess for me, the one issue is I would just be very wary of just adopting U.S. gun safety frameworks for Israel, because the U.S. is an example of how, in this context, they're very challenged. They actually speak to a liberal notion of common sense that I don't think is realistic. And then you build from these structural changes to then start thinking about political change, structural change, all of these factors. And so I've become kind of a ground up person, just because, again, I'm living in a place where I'm surrounded by guns all the time, and I realize that a background check is not going to make any difference because it's a point of sale check that also is discriminatory. And so it's forcing us to create new solutions. And so part of it is, I would say, to look at the new strains of how people are addressing this, particularly after the 24 election, where a lot of gun safety laws are going to quickly become irrelevant just based on what the Trump administration is going to do. And so there are new strategies emerging that are much more structural than they are based in public health. And so that's part of it. And then the other thing is, I think we need global alliances of people advocating gun safety and looking at it in this way. And so the gun issues have been seen as a US issue for so long, but right now having alliances between different countries that are facing this, I think, is a super important point. And again, I realize the Israel context is incredibly different in tons of ways, except that there's so much of it, as I wrote in my piece, that seems incredibly similar.
Great. Thank you for all of that. So, Rela, I want to turn to you and ask you this question about what's possible. Given everything that you and Meisa and Jonathan have described, will you talk to us, please, about the role of gun control advocacy in Israel-Palestine? You're the coalition coordinator for Gun-Free Kitchen Tables. Talk to us about what Gun-Free Kitchen Tables is, what you do, who is in this coalition, and what do you think is possible to accomplish?
The coalition, we've struggled for over a decade to prevent the current developments. I can say to our credit that we saw it coming. We went to court to demand enforcement of preventive laws because there were some of these in place, although they weren't enforced by and large. We even had some limited successes. We developed and submitted proposals for new gun laws, emphasizing prevention rather than punishment, which, being a very focused and a small outfit, I agree, Jonathan, is not enough, but it is a piece of the whole puzzle that wasn't there. And these proposals are still relevant and ready for the right time. They'll need to be revamped, but they're there, and we worked very hard and intensively on them. But due to this country's deep-running militarization, gun control wasn't perceived by civil society at large as an issue at all before we made it one. Through an engaged coalition of 20 women's civil society and social justice organizations, we have succeeded in placing it today on the agendas of member organizations and also reached pretty far beyond to a much broader network. But, and it's a big but, a worst case scenario is now playing out before our eyes. So still, based on years of our monitoring and research, we are able today, what we weren't years ago, to track and record the details of this scenario. We've started collecting data independently as well to reduce our dependence on government sources that are very problematic. We can describe the new reality, and I just did a little bit of that, and Meisa is doing some of that. Its specifics, what it's causing, all of that is vital to any kind of effective action to, at some point, end or reverse it. We spread this knowledge and turn attention to it. We continue doing that, even though the mass armament is ongoing. In face of this enormous gun proliferation, we're growing. and strengthening a broad civil movement opposing this process. Through our feminist lens, the damages caused by armament are unevenly distributed through our society. And I don't mean exclusively women when I say feminist. We identify various groups at risk, for instance, mentally challenged people that stay unseen and unreported in the mainstream. In very creative collaboration with Jonathan and with other experienced US allies, we're also forming and holding up a vision of small arms disarmament, of rolling back today's gun drive. Israel's government branded civilian armament, as Meisa has already mentioned, as a crisis-related emergency measure. That means, in other words, that it's supposedly temporary. We want to hold them to that idea. We instill the possibility of an expiration date for this process and present the urgency of removing multiplying guns when the current warfare subsides. A return to relative calm must, we claim, involve disarming city streets, campuses, playgrounds, malls, and homes. This is crucial to phasing out violence and restoring some level of normalcy and some level of democracy.
Thank you, Rela. So, Meisa, Rela just gave us this vision for what it looks like, something of a return to a normalcy with fewer guns. But everything that we have talked about is, we've been talking about, touched on the struggle to end apartheid in Israel, or Rela has talked about the genocide in Gaza and the spread of weapons also into the West Bank. I want to ask you, Meisa, to talk about what advocacy around guns looks like for Palestinians inside of 48 and how it connects to this broader picture around Palestinians. And also ask you to comment on how you understand the feminist angle on this work on guns, the way that Rela talked about that feminist angle as well.
Well, I do see that militarization is big part of the problem, and the whole context of Israel compared to the US is different in that sense that militarization is part of the daily practice or the mentality, the mainstream Israeli mentality, and that the sense of emergency, which is a lot of it is psychological, do serve in that means the increase or the whole legal system that and the Knesset, the parliament intentions to push for wider or more people holding guns in the civilian sphere. Well, from a gender perspective, as usually we do see as a feminist too, that it's not just about militarization, but also about ethnicity and also about economics and also about different aspects and layers of the whole big picture. So what's going on in the ground is an outcome of so many different aspects and not just one specific reason. So that's why I do connect with that, with what Jonathan said before about if you have a better light in the streets, you would have better, I don't know, cities and then better neighborhoods, and the whole atmosphere would affect the number of gun crime happening in that zone. And I do connect with that highly. And what I see in the Palestinian cities and villages inside Israel is that the more the state is not exist in terms of services and lack of budget and lack of basic services, the crime organization take much more role and they're much more centric in the life of the community in that place. And one thing feeds the other in that sense. And I see my job and my colleagues and my friends and in gun-free kitchen tables and Women Against Weapon is to point out these facts, to try to find these small cracks where we can enter and try to enlighten the reasons, the symptoms, and what can we change in terms of local movement and activism in order to make it happening. So we are, for example, part of the forum for the municipal work done. It's a kind of different parties of municipal parties and mayors and activists from civil society who sit around the round table and try to discuss and find solutions for specific topics and issues. So militarization is big part of the problem, and also state services is part of it. But in general, we need to see the picture as a whole. I cannot really divide it into pieces. And thank you, Sarah Ann, for having me and Rela in the same conversation, speaking about two different sides of the same coin, actually, of armament in Israel, which affects everyone, I think, in daily life, whether it's a Jewish or Palestinian. And if we aspire for a democratic space, for a place where it's possible to have a co-living one next to the other as Palestinians and Israelis and Syrians and Lebanese and the whole Middle East, we do need to recognize the fact that militarization and spaces flooded with guns is not supporting, or at least it's not in a benefit of the zone, of the whole area in the Middle East.
Thank you for all of that, Meisa. And also for being game and willing to put these conversations next to each other. It was, I think, it's really juicy. It's really generative to hear you talking. You're providing, both of you, all three of you, like this top level analysis of what do the guns represent and what are the structures of these societies. What do the guns mean? What is the structure in talking about Israel and looking at Jewish supremacy or this highly militarized society and the proliferation of guns, and trying to understand how they're used and what they mean in a society that is so fundamentally driven with Jewish supremacy and violence against Palestinians and control over Palestinians, both inside the Green Line and in the West Bank. And also at the same time, what you've both just talked about, Rela and Meisa, is the activism and the interventions from the ground, the work that you're doing as activists of looking for spaces where it is actually possible to reduce the number of weapons and reduce the arms that people are using against each other in civilian society. It's a really interesting and unexpected, I think, way to look at these issues, not just from an analytical or the structural place, but also from both of you as activists and as people so active in your society with big analysis, but trying to make change where it's possible, which, as Rela described, you have lots of plans on the books for when the day might become possible to implement them. So thank you both for being so available and willing for this. And thank you, Rela and Meisa, for this work that you're doing. Do you have any last words, last explanations, last anything that you want to leave with this mostly, but not only American audience that is listening to you?
I'll say that, I'm witnessing a genocide, and in parallel, witnessing mass armament. Both of them, although they're connected and different at the same time, with profound sadness and outrage. So I try to find and to do some of the work that may someday help with an almost impossible but very vital task of healing.
Thank you, Rela. Meisa, do you want to add anything?
I can say shortly that what keeps our work going is the very deep faith that we do serve an idea and not persons and not policies and not countries. We do serve the idea of freedom, of peaceful living, of dignity for everyone. And what leads that work is that the very deep belief that it's possible and it's doable, and we all in the Middle East deserve a better life and a better security in terms of our human feminist security, not security that is flooded with guns, but a security of waking up every day knowing that we can have a daily life routine, we can go to work, schools, and develop our personal and environmental life. And what's going now also is a very, I would say, the genocide ongoing in Gaza is an outcome of such small practices. And I do believe that militarization is not just holding a gun and shooting someone, but the daily practice of having the gun next to you or on you and doing that day in daily basis without thinking or criticizing yourself about the need, the power you are holding in your hands. And very small acts lead to get into a day where there's crimes against humanity and war crimes like a genocide, and people still support it. So if we are speaking about democratic processes, it is the small things that do make the big changes in terms of having a space that can contain everyone, diverse, and respect humans as just for being humans.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Jonathan had to hop off, but I thank Jonathan also for being with us and for everything that he brought to this conversation. So grateful for your time and your energy. And I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast. We mentioned lots of things that are links that we have posted up that Jonathan, Rela, and Meisa have written, their writing, and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and to Israel. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast so you can stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Sarah Ann Minkin, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts. Take care.